Have you ever wondered how a country can go from an economic powerhouse to a wasteland in such a short time? Many nations around the world are falling apart before our eyes, and what is most worrying is that the fall of some of them could have devastating impacts on the entire planet. What is happening? Are we witnessing the end of an era? As some countries face famine, economic collapse, and war, solutions seem increasingly distant. But at the same time, there is a natural curiosity to understand what went wrong, and, more importantly, what comes next. Today, we will explore the stories behind these countries on the brink of collapse, uncover the causes of this collapse, and, perhaps, find clues about what the future holds for us. Now click like, and subscribing will only take a second, and it still helps us. There are moments in history when we feel like the ground beneath our feet is crumbling, and the world around us seems to be on the verge of imminent collapse. Today, we live in one of those eras. Instability infiltrates every corner of the globe, triggering crises we never imagined. Borders, once solid, have now become tenuous lines of survival, and economies, once prosperous, find themselves trapped in cycles of decline. What happened to the nations that were once symbols of strength and stability? Why do they now seem to be on the brink? The warning signs did not appear suddenly. They accumulated over the years, like small cracks in a grand but worn-out structure. Uncontrolled inflation, growing social inequality, corrupt governments, and internal conflicts are just some of the symptoms that announce that something is very wrong. Each new crisis only accelerates the fall, like a snowball rolling downhill. And it is in this scenario that we ask ourselves, are we about to witness the collapse of entire countries? As we watch these signs, we cannot ignore the central question: why is this happening now? What has changed in the world that so many once strong nations are facing the risk of falling apart? The answer is rooted in deep interconnected factors, from economic crises to the depletion of natural resources, and even the way technology and climate shape the future. What is left for us to do in the face of this tide of uncertainty? Curiosity about countries that once flourished and now wither is just the beginning of our reflection. Get ready for an in-depth journey behind the scenes of the most overwhelming crises of our time. As we explore each of these stories, you will see how these situations shape the present and the future. This is just the beginning of an analysis of nations that are on the brink of collapse. Next, we will see how the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has turned into a true nightmare for millions. When we think of Venezuela, what was once one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America, now takes us to a land marked by hunger, despair, and an unprecedented crisis. Food shortages have gripped a nation that once prided itself on its oil wealth. Today, millions of Venezuelans struggle daily for a plate of food. Entire families travel long distances, standing in endless queues, hoping to get some rice or flour. This tragic scenario is the direct result of a crumbling economy and policies that pushed the country into the abyss. The economic crisis has plunged Venezuela into a situation where there is not just a lack of food, there is a lack of hope. The exodus of millions of Venezuelans forced to leave their homeland in search of survival has become one of the largest migrations in recent history. They are ordinary people, fathers and mothers, young and old, who leave behind everything they know, risking their lives in search of an opportunity in foreign lands. The desperation is such that many leave without knowing exactly what awaits them at their destination, only with the certainty that staying means succumbing. This mass flight, however, is not the only consequence. For those who remain, the future is uncertain and bleak. The prospects for the Venezuelan people are for even more difficult days ahead. The country, trapped in a spiral of corruption, authoritarianism, and economic crises, offers no visible way out for its citizens. And although there are many promises of reconstruction and international aid, the reality is that the solution to this crisis seems increasingly distant. The story of Venezuela is a stark warning of how a country, even with vast natural resources, can sink into complete chaos. Venezuela's collapse is not just a local tragedy, but a stark example for the world. And unfortunately, she is not alone. Next, we'll explore what's happening in Lebanon, where another nation faces a devastating economic collapse. Lebanon, once known as the Switzerland of the Middle East, is now facing a devastating economic crisis, which has destroyed not only its financial infrastructure, but also the confidence of its population. The devaluation of the Lebanese currency is frightening. The money that was once worth so much now has no real weight. Purchasing power disappeared, and inflation took over all sectors. People who once lived with a certain comfort now struggle to buy basic items, while the country sinks into debt that seems impossible to resolve. The chaos in the banking system is another brutal blow to the Lebanese people. Accounts, which were previously secure, became inaccessible. Banks that limit withdrawals, desperate people trying to take away what belongs to them, and a general feeling of impotence. The banking collapse affected all layers of society. Small business owners have closed their doors, unable to sustain their businesses, while ordinary families find themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty. The financial system, which should be the foundation of growth, has become the very trap that keeps Lebanon trapped in its tragic destiny. The most alarming thing, however, is the shortage of fuel and medicine, essential items for the population's survival. The country is in a constant struggle to obtain basic resources, and the price of this despair falls on the shoulders of the people. Hospitals in collapse, people without access to medicine, and queues that seem endless at gas stations. Daily life in Lebanon has become a constant battle against a lack of infrastructure and government incompetence. Society, exhausted, finds itself increasingly adrift, with no clear prospects for improvement. Faced with this scenario of ruins, what is left for the Lebanese people? The fight for survival continues as the country plunges deeper into a financial abyss. However, Lebanon is not alone on this dark path. Next, we'll explore how growing social inequality is turning all of Latin America into a powder keg ready to explode. Latin America has always been a region marked by profound contrasts. On the one hand, we see modern skyscrapers and emerging economies, but at the same time, extreme poverty still affects millions of people. Brazil and Argentina, two of the largest economies in the region, are emblematic examples of this growing inequality. Amid political and economic crises, the gap between the richest and the poorest continues to widen. The favelas that surround the big cities and the underserved outskirts reveal a harsh reality. While few enjoy luxury, the majority fight daily for survival. This extreme inequality is reflected on the streets. Massive protests have become a constant in many Latin American countries, where the population, tired of empty promises, decides to rise up against ineffective and corrupt governments. Thousands take to the squares, demanding structural changes, calling for social justice and an economy that works for everyone, and not just for a small elite. The images of these movements reverberate around the world, showing a Latin America on the verge of boiling, where popular patience is reaching its limit. Rising unemployment is another factor contributing to this social crisis. In countries like Brazil and Argentina, the job market is unable to absorb demand, leaving millions without the prospect of decent employment. Without income, these people find themselves pushed to the suburbs, where poverty and violence go hand in hand. Meanwhile, young people, who should be the future of the region, face the harsh reality of poor education and a lack of opportunities. The cycle of poverty perpetuates itself, fueling a social powder keg that could explode at any moment. With each economic crisis, social inequality becomes deeper, and Latin America walks a dangerous tightrope. The lack of clear and effective solutions only exacerbates the problem. But if you think inequality is the biggest villain, what we'll see next is even scarier. Rampant corruption in governments that should protect their citizens but end up destroying their own nations. When talking about corruption, it is impossible not to think of countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua, where abuse of power and mismanagement have eroded the foundations of the government. Corruption is a silent virus, which slowly devours a nation's resources, diverting public money into the pockets of an elite that governs with impunity. To those watching from the outside, it seems surreal how these nations, which should have so much potential, are on the brink of collapse. However, for citizens living under these regimes, the reality is even crueler. Systemic corruption is not limited to political scandals or embezzlement of funds. It infiltrates all layers of government and society. In Venezuela, the government has not only allowed but encouraged a system of total control where power is maintained through intimidation and repression. In Nicaragua, the scenario is similar. Leaders accumulate wealth while the population suffers from poverty and hunger. The result is a disillusioned, voiceless population that finds itself trapped in a cycle of misery and despair without any hope of change. The most alarming, perhaps, is the disconnect between the rulers and the people. Corruption creates an insurmountable barrier where the needs of the population are completely ignored. Empty promises and manipulative speeches only serve to mask reality. While corrupt politicians get rich, the people are left behind without access to basic services, such as health and education. This disconnect is the fuel for uprisings and protests, but unfortunately, real change always seems far away. With leaders who rule with an iron fist and a corrupt machine that sustains these regimes, destruction seems inevitable. Corruption not only paralyzes a nation's development, but also destroys its future. However, corruption is just one of many factors that can lead to collapse. Next, we will see how internal conflicts in Ethiopia threaten to divide the country and throw millions of people into a new humanitarian crisis. Ethiopia, a country with a rich and diverse history, is today on the brink of a conflict that threatens its very existence. Ethnic tensions in the Tigray region are a time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. What began as a political dispute turned into an armed conflict, dragging millions of people into a cycle of violence and despair. Entire families were forced to abandon their homes, leaving behind everything they knew. Hunger, violence, and lack of security have become the new normal for thousands of Ethiopians. What makes this conflict even more devastating is the humanitarian crisis that accompanies it. Hunger is one of the main weapons used in combat, with civilians being deliberately deprived of food and water. Children who should be playing in the streets or attending school are now struggling to survive. The number of internally displaced people grows every day, and humanitarian aid, when it arrives, is insufficient to serve everyone. The human tragedy unfolding in Ethiopia is a cruel reminder of how internal conflicts can destroy the lives of millions. Furthermore, the risk of fragmentation in Ethiopia is a reality that scares both the population and the international community. The country, which has always been a symbol of unity in Africa, is now on the verge of splitting into enemy factions. Ethnic groups are fighting for control of power, and the prospect of a full-scale civil war appears increasingly imminent. The weakened central government is struggling to maintain control, but with each passing day, the situation appears more desperate. Ethiopia is on the brink of a catastrophe that could have devastating consequences for the entire region. The fate of millions of people is at stake, and peace seems increasingly distant. But Ethiopia is not the only country where the struggle for natural resources is worsening the crisis. Next, we will see how the unrestrained exploitation of minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo generated a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a country incredibly rich in natural resources, but this wealth has been a curse for its people. Minerals such as gold, diamonds, and coltan, essential to the global technology industry, should be a boon for the country's development. However, the rampant exploitation of these resources has generated rampant violence, turning Congo into a battlefield where armed groups fight for control of the mines. The soil, which could feed prosperity, is now watered with the blood of innocent civilians. In many regions of Congo, the population lives hostage to conflicts over minerals. Men, women, and children are forced to work in the mines in inhumane conditions, while rebel groups and militias grow rich off their misery. Natural resources, which should be a source of progress, have become the root of an ongoing tragedy. External exploitation, especially by international corporations, further worsens the situation. These companies profit while the Congolese people pay the highest possible price. External exploitation plays a crucial role in perpetuating this tragedy. International corporations buy these minerals at ridiculous prices without caring about the inhumane conditions in which they are extracted. This chain of exploitation stretches across the globe, but its most devastating effects are felt in the Congo. It is a vicious cycle where the country's natural wealth is drained, while its population remains trapped in extreme poverty and constant violence. The Democratic Republic of Congo represents a clear example of how human greed can destroy a nation. The collapse of its natural resources is closely linked to the destruction of its society. And as the mines run out and the wars continue, the nation's future looks increasingly bleak. But this is not the only resource-related tragedy. Next, we'll look at how climate disasters are threatening Bangladesh's existence and forcing millions to flee their homes. Bangladesh, a densely populated, low-lying country, faces one of the biggest threats of the 21st century. The sinking of its land due to climate change, rising sea levels caused by global warming are slowly engulfing Bangladesh's coastal areas, forcing millions of people to abandon their homes. Entire communities, which depended on agriculture to survive, now face a daily struggle against flooding and the loss of fertile land. What was once a safe home is now a battleground against nature. Extreme weather events, such as cyclones and floods, have become increasingly frequent and devastating. Torrential rains, which were once predictable, now fall with extraordinary force, destroying crops and infrastructure. Every time water invades villages, more families are displaced, turning Bangladesh into one of the main hotspots for climate refugees in the world. People who previously lived in peace now find themselves forced to migrate, often to overcrowded cities with no resources to accommodate them. This environmental crisis has a direct impact on the economy of Bangladesh. With the loss of fertile land and forced migration to urban areas, the country faces a dilemma: how to feed its growing population when resources are rapidly dwindling. The already fragile economy is being pushed towards collapse as the country tries to deal with natural disasters that seem to have no end. With each flood, the hope of reconstruction becomes more distant, and the population lives in constant fear that the next disaster will be even worse. However, the fight for survival continues, with the government and international organizations trying to mitigate the effects of these catastrophes. The reality in Bangladesh is a painful example of how climate change can destabilize an entire country. But this fight for survival goes beyond Bangladesh's borders. Next, we will see how the migration crisis in Europe, caused by conflict and economic collapse, is putting pressure on the borders of countries trying to deal with the influx of refugees. Europe, with its once open and welcoming borders, now finds itself under pressure from an unprecedented migration crisis. The civil war in Syria, conflicts in the Middle East, and the economic collapse in several regions of the world have forced millions of people to seek refuge on the European continent. The impact of the war in Syria, in particular, has been devastating. Entire families cross borders, risking their lives in search of a safe place to start over. Scenes of overcrowded boats in the Mediterranean have become tragic symbols of an endless exodus. European border countries, such as Greece and Turkey, are at the center of this migratory hurricane. With limited resources and overburdened reception systems, these countries face the daily challenge of trying to deal with the massive arrival of refugees. Makeshift camps dot the borders, where thousands of people live in precarious conditions, waiting for the chance to start over. However, with the increasing flow of migrants, pressure on these countries increases, and internal tensions begin to worsen. Xenophobia, which was previously just lurking, is now gaining strength. The rise of intolerance in European countries has become a sad reality. Instead of being a safe haven, Europe has turned into a political and social battlefield, where acceptance of refugees is mixed with fear and distrust. The attacks on reception centers and growing anti-immigration rhetoric reflect a continent struggling to find balance between its humanitarian heritage and the reality of a global migration crisis. This crisis not only destabilizes borders, but also shakes the social and economic structures of many European countries. The ability to welcome and integrate migrants is in question, and Europe as a whole faces one of its biggest challenges of the century. However, as physical borders are challenged, other threats grow from within. Below, we will explore how the spread of terrorism in Africa, particularly Nigeria, is destabilizing entire regions and creating new waves of terror. Nigeria, one of the most populous and economically important countries in Africa, has become the scene of an invisible and devastating war, that of terrorism. Extremist groups such as Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa have spread fear and chaos across entire regions of the country. What began as isolated insurgencies quickly turned into a network of terror that threatens the stability of not only Nigeria, but all of West Africa. The brutal tactics of these groups include kidnappings, massacres, and the destruction of entire communities, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. In many parts of Nigeria, the government has completely lost control. The regions under the rule of Boko Haram and other groups are practically parallel states, where the law is imposed by violence and fear. The defenseless civilian population lives in constant terror of attacks. Thousands of families have been displaced from their homes, forced to flee to refugee camps within their own country. Nigeria's already fragile infrastructure is crumbling under the weight of these conflicts, and a sense of security is a distant memory for many. The impact of these conflicts is devastating for local populations. Schools are closed, children are forcibly recruited to fight, and women are often victims of unimaginable abuse. The local economy, which depended on agriculture and commerce, was annihilated in many areas. Terror has become a force that not only destroys lives, but also paralyzes the development of entire regions. What remains for the affected communities is the daily struggle for survival, without any real hope for a better future. Nigeria is just one example of how terrorism can destabilize an entire nation. Entire regions are being destroyed by this extremist advance, which seems to have no end. But terrorism is not the only threat challenging global stability. Next, we will see how the COVID-19 pandemic has deeply shaken countries like Brazil and India, leaving scars that are still far from being healed. The COVID-19 pandemic has swept the world with devastating force, but in countries like Brazil and India, the impact has been especially brutal. What began as a public health crisis quickly turned into a social and economic catastrophe. Overloaded hospitals, lack of beds, oxygen and medicines painted a desperate scenario. Thousands of lives were lost every day, while the population watched helplessly as a tragedy that seemed to have no end. In Brazil, cemeteries filled up at an impressive speed, and in India, funeral pyres lit up the nights, silent witnesses of collective pain. The health systems of these countries, which were already facing major challenges, collapsed under the pressure of the pandemic. In Brazil, exhausted health professionals struggled to save lives with scarce resources, while the government struggled between controversial decisions. In India, chaos spread to cities and towns, where infrastructure could not keep up with the desperate demand for treatment. The population's desperation was reflected in endless queues in front of hospitals, and the frantic search for medicines and vaccines that often were simply not available. In addition to the human tragedy, the pandemic paralyzed the economies of Brazil and India in a devastating way. Small businesses closed their doors, millions of people lost their jobs, and mass impoverishment became a cruel reality. Informality, which was already a strong characteristic in these countries, intensified even further, leaving millions of families in a situation of extreme vulnerability. The pandemic exposed the structural flaws of their economies, deepening inequalities and leaving a legacy of uncertainty. The loss of millions of lives and the collective trauma left by the pandemic will be felt for many years to come. Brazil and India, two emerging giants, now face the challenge of rebuilding their economies and healing the deep wounds that COVID-19 has left. However, while these nations seek to rebuild, others face different battles, such as the war and collapse in Yemen, which we will discuss below. Yemen, a country already marked by decades of instability, is currently experiencing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. The civil war, which seemed like a distant political dispute, plunged the country into total collapse. The state system has collapsed, and the central government no longer has control over large areas of territory. What remains is a no-man's land, where different factions fight for power, while the civilian population suffers the consequences of an endless war. Children, women, and the elderly are most affected, trapped in a cycle of violence, hunger, and despair. Hunger in Yemen is used as a weapon of war, and millions of people are on the brink of starvation. Food shortages are so severe that many families are forced to eat leaves to survive. The lack of access to clean water and basic sanitation further worsens the situation, creating a fertile ground for diseases that spread quickly. The country's healthcare system, already fragile before the war, is now completely collapsed. Hospitals were destroyed by bombings, and those that still operate are without resources to meet the enormous demand. International intervention, led by countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, only prolongs the conflict, transforming Yemen into a geopolitical battlefield. Weapons and resources are poured into the country, fueling the warring factions and further devastating the nation. The civilian population, caught between the interests of foreign powers, sees their country being slowly destroyed without any prospect of peace. The suffering of Yemenis has become almost invisible to the rest of the world, but the reality is that the crisis in Yemen is an open wound that continues to bleed. Yemen's collapse is a painful example of how state failure and foreign interference can destroy a nation. However, Yemen is not the only country to suffer from the consequences of external interventions. Next, we will see how Venezuela faces a similar situation, where sanctions and external support shape the fate of a devastated nation. Venezuela, plunged into a deep crisis, has become a stage where foreign powers vie for influence. While the United States imposed severe sanctions, trying to put pressure on Maduro's government, countries like Russia and China stepped up their support, offering resources and military support. What should have been a help for the population to recover turned into a complex network of geopolitical interests. In the midst of this dispute, those who suffer are the Venezuelan people, who live in a country paralyzed by decisions that are often made outside its borders. U.S. sanctions, for example, have a devastating impact on Venezuela's economy. Oil, which is the country's main source of income, has suffered major restrictions, further worsening the scarcity of resources. The idea behind these sanctions was to force a change in the regime, but the result was an even more impoverished population with limited access to food and medicine. For many Venezuelans, the aid that was supposed to bring hope has become a new form of external control, worsening the country's already critical situation. On the other hand, support from Russia and China, which was supposed to strengthen Maduro's government, also brought negative consequences. The growing dependence on these two foreign countries to support infrastructure and the military sector has made Venezuela's sovereignty even more fragile. The geopolitical struggle between global powers turns Venezuela into a chessboard, where the objective is not the well-being of the population, but control of a strategic region in Latin America. The struggle for power in Venezuela shows how external interventions, whether in the form of sanctions or military support, can turn a country into a pawn in the hands of more powerful nations. As Venezuelans struggle to survive amid the chaos, the situation continues to deteriorate. However, Venezuela is not alone in this economic battle. Next, we will see how Argentina faces an economic freefall, with recurring crises that threaten its future. Argentina, a country rich in history and culture, has become one of the clearest examples of how recurring financial crises can destroy a nation's confidence. The collapse of its economy is not a one-time event, but rather the result of decades of instability and unsuccessful economic policies. The devaluation of the Argentine peso and galloping inflation eroded the population's purchasing power. What once appeared to be an emerging economy is now on the brink of bankruptcy, with financial markets fleeing in search of safer places to invest. Capital flight is one of the clearest signs that the Argentine economy is in free fall. International investors, fearing the worst, quickly withdraw their money, leaving the country in a financial vacuum. Without these external resources, Argentina is left without the means to stabilize its economy. The result is a chain crisis. The government tries to intervene, but its measures are seen as insufficient or even harmful, increasing distrust and further scaring away investors. The vicious circle continues to turn, with no visible solution in sight. Inflation, once a constant pain in Argentina's past, has returned with a vengeance. The prices of basic products skyrocket, and the population finds itself trapped in a daily struggle to guarantee the minimum necessary. The money that was once enough to live comfortably now barely covers the most basic needs. The middle class, which was the pillar of the Argentine economy, is rapidly disappearing, being pushed into poverty. The social impact of this economic crisis is devastating and profound, affecting all generations. The collapse of Argentina's economy shows how fragile financial markets can destroy a country's foundations. Confidence, once shaken, is difficult to rebuild, and Argentina faces the challenge of trying to recover what has been lost. However, the effects of technology on employment are also a growing threat in many countries around the world. Next, we'll look at how the age of automation is affecting global unemployment, especially in developing economies. With the advancement of technology, the world is experiencing a new revolution, the era of automation. Intelligent machines and systems are replacing the human workforce at an impressive speed. And although this brings efficiency to industries, it generates a silent crisis in many countries. Automation, especially in emerging economies, has caused a wave of mass unemployment, and millions of workers find themselves in a scenario where their jobs have simply disappeared. What remains is a void, where opportunities seem to become increasingly rare. The loss of jobs in the industry is one of the most visible impacts of this technological revolution. Factories that once employed hundreds of workers now operate with just a fraction of that number, using robots to perform the heavy, repetitive work. This not only reduces companies' operating costs, but also eliminates the need for skilled labor in many areas. In countries that depended on industry to generate jobs, such as in Latin America and Asia, unemployment is becoming a social crisis, further worsening inequalities. The challenge of education also appears as an important obstacle. Many countries simply do not have adequate programs to reskill their populations for the jobs of the future. While automation advances, training for new skills lags behind. Governments are trying to make up for their losses by implementing training programs in areas such as information technology and artificial intelligence. But the truth is that the transition is being slower than necessary. The job market has changed, but education seems to be stuck in the past. The rise of inequality is another direct consequence of automation. Those who have access to education and new technologies are able to prosper, while a significant part of the world's population is left behind, trapped in jobs that are disappearing or no longer offer a future. The age of automation, while promising in many ways, is creating an economic and social chasm that may be difficult to bridge. And as technology reshapes the job market, another threat emerges in the form of misinformation. Next, we'll explore how the culture of fear and fake news are being used in Russia to maintain its grip on power. In Russia, fear is a powerful tool that sustains Vladimir Putin's regime. Media manipulation and the spread of fake news have been used strategically to keep the population under control and ensure the perpetuation of power. Absolute control over the media allows the government to shape the national narrative, suppressing dissent and amplifying a climate of uncertainty and paranoia. Manipulated news, conspiracy theories, and distorted information are widely disseminated, creating a scenario in which truth becomes a matter of perspective. Russian media control is so vast that for much of the population, the information they receive about the outside world is limited and carefully filtered. Propaganda is broadcast daily, painting the government as the only protector of the people against external and internal threats. This constant narrative feeds the culture of fear, where any criticism of the regime is seen as treason, and political opponents are labeled as enemies of the state. The result is a people who, for the most part, distrust the outside world and remain loyal to the regime. Fake news plays a crucial role in this dynamic. Disinformation is used to destabilize other nations while strengthening the perception that Russia is always under attack. This strategy is not limited to the country's borders. The Russian government has been accused of interfering in foreign elections, spreading fake news to influence public opinion in other countries. The use of bots and disinformation campaigns on social media has become a new form of silent warfare, with devastating impacts on public trust and democracy in many parts of the world. This culture of fear and information manipulation not only maintains control within Russia, but also exports insecurity to the rest of the world. Misinformation erodes trust in institutions, both at home and abroad, creating an environment where the truth becomes difficult to discern. However, Russia is not the only country facing the impact of international sanctions. Next, we will see how the sanctions imposed on Iran are sinking its economy and provoking growing popular resistance. Iran, a nation rich in culture and history, today lives under the crushing weight of international sanctions. These measures, led mainly by the United States, were imposed to pressure the country to abandon its nuclear program. However, the impact of sanctions goes far beyond the military and nuclear sector. They have profoundly affected the daily lives of Iranians, plunging the economy into an almost irreversible collapse. Sanctions restricted oil trade, Iran's main source of revenue, and the result was an economic blackout that paralyzed the country. The fuel and electricity crisis is a direct reflection of this blackout. Iran, which has one of the largest oil reserves in the world, now faces endless queues at gas stations, with citizens struggling to get the bare minimum. Energy shortages have also become a cruel reality, leaving large regions without electricity for hours or even days. The population, which was already dealing with a difficult economic scenario, now finds itself under even more pressure, with an infrastructure that cannot support the nation's basic needs. International sanctions have also hit the health sector, making it difficult to import medicines and medical equipment. The COVID-19 pandemic has further aggravated this situation, revealing the fragility of an already overloaded system. With rising inflation and currency devaluation, the cost of living has soared, and millions of Iranians face a daily struggle to survive. Frustration with the current situation has generated a wave of protests, where the population expresses its resistance not only against the sanctions, but also against the government itself. Popular resistance has been growing, fueled by the desperation of a population that sees few options. The streets of Iran, once the scene of massive demonstrations, are now buzzing with calls for change. However, as Iran faces this economic blackout, the struggle for resources in the Middle East continues to shape the region's future. Next, we'll look at how oil conflicts in Iraq and Syria are fueling wars and geopolitical disputes that challenge global stability. The Middle East has always been a fertile ground for geopolitical disputes, and oil is the fuel that fuels many of these conflicts. In Iraq and Syria, control of oil reserves has become one of the main motivations behind wars that have lasted decades. International powers, such as the United States, Russia, and regional powers, are all involved in a complex web of interests, where oil wealth not only decides the fate of nations, but also shapes global stability. Oil, which was supposed to be a blessing, became a curse, throwing entire countries into chaos. In Iraq, wars over oil fields have devastated the country. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, the country was plunged into a series of internal conflicts and external interventions that turned its vast oil reserves into a target of disputes. Armed factions, terrorist groups, and foreign powers compete for control, while the population suffers the consequences. What should be a resource for economic development has become the center of an incessant war, where wealth is drained and peace seems increasingly distant. In Syria, the scenario is equally devastating. The Syrian conflict, which began as a political uprising, quickly turned into a war over resources. Control of the oil fields in eastern Syria is one of the factors prolonging the civil war in the country. Extremist groups, such as the Islamic State, have profited from the illegal sale of oil, while foreign powers, such as the US and Russia, are fighting for influence in the region. The Syrian people, who should benefit from their natural riches, find themselves in the middle of a dispute that has brought only destruction and misery. The future of oil in the Middle East is uncertain as new energy sources emerge and reserves begin to run out. However, the impact of resource wars is profound and lasting, not only for the countries directly involved, but for the world as a whole. The fight for oil continues to shape the global balance of power, and while these battles are fought, other economies seek alternative ways of survival. Next, we will see how the informal economy has become an escape valve for millions of people in Latin America, especially in Venezuela. In Latin America, the informal economy has become the main form of survival for millions of people. In countries like Venezuela, where the economic collapse has left a large part of the population without formal employment, informality is the only way to guarantee a livelihood. On the streets of big cities, parallel markets appear on every corner, offering everything: food, clothes, electronics, and even basic services. The informal economy is a reflection of a failed system, where the state can no longer provide the necessary conditions for formal work, and citizens need to find alternatives to survive. In Venezuela, the black market flourishes as a direct response to the lack of essential products on supermarket shelves. With the collapse of the currency and uncontrolled inflation, many Venezuelans resort to selling smuggled products or exchanged in clandestine networks. This shadow economy is not just a matter of necessity. It became a form of resistance. While the government struggles to control the official economy, the streets create their own rules. The people find a way to continue fighting in the midst of chaos on the margins of legality. Crime also grows in this informal environment. Rising unemployment and lack of opportunities push many into the world of organized crime. Robberies, drug trafficking, and smuggling have become common in several parts of Latin America, where the formal economy can no longer absorb the mass of workers. Informality, which should be a temporary solution, ends up becoming an endless cycle, where precarious working conditions and the lack of rights increase inequalities and perpetuate poverty. The informal economy in Latin America reveals the failure of systems that can no longer guarantee the minimum for their citizens. While the state fails, the people improvise, seeking ways to survive in an environment where rules are fluid and security is a matter of luck. However, despite this chaotic scenario, there is still hope for reconstruction. Next, we will see how countries like Afghanistan, devastated by years of war, try to rebuild themselves and find a possible future. Rebuilding a country devastated by war or economic collapse is a monumental task. In Afghanistan, after years of conflict, the nation faces the challenge of trying to rebuild itself amidst the ruins. What was once a vibrant country with a rich culture and an ancient history is now a field of debris where hope seems distant. However, despite the difficulties, the reconstruction process has begun, with NGOs and international organizations mobilizing to bring relief and support to the most affected communities. But will foreign aid be enough to rebuild an entire nation? The role of international organizations is crucial, but also limited. While humanitarian aid provides immediate relief, long-term reconstruction depends on something deeper: the ability to create strong, sustainable institutions. In Afghanistan, reconstruction is not just about rebuilding buildings and infrastructure, but about re-establishing trust in government institutions, education, and healthcare. Without a solid system, any progress made could crumble in the face of the next crisis, leaving the population in a constant struggle for stability. The challenges of starting from scratch are immense. Corruption, the failure of local leadership, and external interference are obstacles that often slow down progress. Even with the best of intentions, rebuilding a war-torn country can take decades, and results are not always guaranteed. For the citizens left behind, those who could not or would not flee, life is a daily battle. But even in the midst of chaos, there are stories of resilience, of communities coming together to rebuild their lives with what little is left. Rebuilding a devastated country offers valuable lessons for the world, especially for other nations facing similar crises. She reminds us that although destruction is swift and violent, recovery is slow and requires patience and dedication. However, history also shows us that some nations, such as the Roman Empire and the USSR, never fully recovered. Below, we'll explore the lessons history teaches us about the collapse of great civilizations, and what we can learn to prevent the same fate from befalling other nations. History is full of examples of great civilizations that, at some point, reached their peak only to collapse in the face of internal and external crises. The Roman Empire, for example, was one of the greatest powers of antiquity, dominating vast regions of the known world. However, his downfall did not happen all at once. It was the result of decades of internal corruption, economic mismanagement, and external invasions. Rome, which seemed invincible, slowly crumbled, teaching us that no nation is above the forces that shape history. Another shocking example is the collapse of the Soviet Union. For much of the 20th century, the USSR was seen as a global superpower, directly rivaling the United States. However, a combination of economic stagnation, lack of political reforms, and the weight of wars fought in Afghanistan and elsewhere ultimately undermined Soviet power. When the USSR fell in 1990, the entire world watched in surprise as a giant collapsed. The lesson here is clear. A nation's greatness is not eternal, and collapse can come quickly when the pillars that support stability begin to crumble. These stories teach us an important lesson about the nature of the power and resilience of nations. Often, the downfall of a civilization or a nation begins from within, with a gradual loss of trust in institutions, endemic corruption, and a disconnect between rulers and the people. While history often repeats itself, what differentiates nations that rise again from those that fall forever is the ability to learn from past mistakes and adapt to new realities. When a nation refuses to recognize its own problems, it is doomed to repeat them. The future of nations facing crises today will be determined by how they respond to these challenges. History shows us that collapse is not inevitable, but requires profound changes and a commitment to reconstruction. What will it take to prevent these countries from following the same fate as Rome or the USSR? In the next and final topic, we will explore the fate of nations on the brink of collapse and what the future may hold for them. The fate of nations on the brink of collapse remains uncertain, and this brings with it a sense of global unrest. For some, the collapse seems inevitable, like a tide that cannot be stopped. For others, there is still hope that these nations can find a way to reverse their fate and avoid total ruin. What is at stake is not just the future of these nations, but the impact that the collapse of entire countries could have on the rest of the world. Global interconnectedness means that when a nation falls, the effects reverberate far beyond its borders. The role of the international community is undoubtedly crucial. Global organizations, foreign powers, and NGOs have the power to influence the future of these countries, whether by helping with reconstruction or perpetuating conflicts through geopolitical interference. The question, however, remains: is there really a viable solution for nations facing such profound crises? While outside help can bring some relief, real change must come from within. Only when the leaders of these nations are willing to face the reality of their internal failings will there be a chance for redemption, hope, or despair. The future of many of these nations is still in the hands of generations to come. Will they learn from past mistakes? Will they have the courage to break cycles of corruption, violence, and inequality? The answer to these questions will determine the fate of millions of people. History shows us that, even in the darkest situations, there is always room for resilience and reconstruction. However, the choice between moving forward or falling into the final abyss is a decision these nations need to make before it is too late. What does the future hold for these countries? This is something no one can predict with certainty. But what we do know is that future generations will have the difficult task of dealing with the consequences of these crises, and the choices made now will determine whether these countries find a path to hope or succumb to despair. Time will tell, but the future is still open.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop. We're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.